Taemin wiped the sweat from his face as he looked at the dead bodies floating in space outside his window. The mining station shook again as another asteroid hit the shields. He had been working in this hell for 3 years now, and every day was the same dangerous work that could kill him in 100 different ways, while aliens sat safe on their pretty worlds counting money. The communication screen buzzed with another message from headquarters. A blue-skinned alien appeared on the screen, with that fake smile they always used when talking to humans. Mining Station Omega 7, your production numbers are down 15% this month. We need you to work harder. The company expects better results from human worker. Stamen wanted to throw his plasma cutter at the screen, but he needed this job. His family back on Earth needed the money. Even if the pay was barely enough to buy food, the aliens always said humans should be grateful for any work at all. After all, they were just Deathworlders from a dangerous planet 3 sectors away. Bio Ra was having her own problems. The security chief stood in the briefing room of Kepler Station looking at the mission report that made her stomach turn. The Xanthari exploration team had found something in the dark caves of Nightmare World, but whatever it was had killed them all. Now the company wanted humans to go clean up the mess. The pay offer was insulting half of what they had offered the Xanthari before those soft aliens had run away screaming. The message from corporate was clear: humans were expendable, so what if a few died cleaning up alien mistakes? That was what Deathworlders were for. On the Outer Rim, salvage captain Dongwu pulled another body from the wreckage of a merchant ship. Void hunters had attacked the convoy and torn it apart like paper. The ship belonged to a rich Trilaxian trading company, but the crew was mostly human. Now those humans were dead, and the insurance company was already saying it was pilot error. Dongwu had seen this before. Human crews took the dangerous jobs that aliens would not touch. Then when things went wrong, the aliens blamed human recklessness. It was never the fault of cheap equipment or impossible schedules. It was always the fault of crazy Deathworlders who did not know how to be careful. Back on Earth, the news channels were full of reports about the great galactic civilization, peaceful species working together to build a better future. Trade and culture flowing between the stars like never before, but they never mentioned who died to make that peace possible. They never talked about the human miners who worked in radioactive asteroid fields, or the human soldiers who fought pirates in the dark between stars. Jin-Ho sat in his small apartment reading the latest government announcement. The Galactic Council had passed new safety regulations that banned humans from most civilian areas on core worlds. Too dangerous, they said, too unpredictable. Humans could only enter through special checkpoints and had to wear identification tags at all times. The same beings who sent humans to fight monsters that gave their warriors nightmares now said humans were too scary to walk around shopping centers. It was like being told you were too dirty to enter a house after spending all day cleaning the sewers that kept the house running. So Young worked the night shift at the processing plant on Kepler Prime, turning raw materials into the components that built galactic civilization. Her hands were covered in chemical burns from the acids that would dissolve most alien skin in seconds. But the plant had to run, and humans were the only ones who could do the work without dying. She had not seen her daughter in 2 years. The little girl lived with relatives back on Earth while So Young worked to pay for her education. Maybe someday the girl could get a better job. Maybe she could work in an office instead of risking her life every day. But probably not. The galaxy had made it clear that humans were born to do the jobs that killed other species on 1,000 different worlds and stations. Humans were having the same thoughts. They were tired of being treated like tools instead of people. They were tired of dying for species that saw them as barely better than animals. They were tired of being paid scraps while their employers got rich from their blood. The breaking point came when the news channels started reporting on the new Human Restriction Act. The Galactic Council had decided that humans were becoming too numerous and too independent. They needed better control, better oversight, better ways to make sure the Deathworlders remembered their place. The act required all humans to register with local authorities before traveling. It limited the number of humans who could live on any single world. It created special zones where humans could be housed away from civilized populations. It was slavery with a pretty name and legal paperwork. That night, secret messages began moving through human networks. Coded communications bounced between mining ships and security stations, carried by traders and mercenaries, who had grown tired of being second-class citizens. The messages were simple, but they carried the weight of 50 years of anger and frustration. No more games. The words spread like wildfire through every human community in the galaxy. Workers looked at each other with new understanding as they realized they were not alone in their anger. Soldiers counted their weapons and wondered what would happen if they stopped pointing them at aliens' enemies and started pointing them at alien masters' mind. Supervisors noticed they're human. Workers talking in small groups. Security chiefs saw their human guards checking equipment more carefully than usual. Ship captains found their human crew members asking strange questions about fuel supplies and navigation charts, but the aliens noticed nothing. They were too busy counting profits and making plans for the future. They had no idea that the tools they had taken for granted were becoming something else. The hammers were turning into weapons. The shields were becoming walls. The servants were becoming an army in the depths of space. Human ships began changing course. Mining vessels altered their routes to avoid alien monitoring stations. Security patrols found reasons to visit systems that had been off-limits for decades. Exploration ships discovered new jump points that led to empty regions where no one would think to look. The galaxy had grown fat and lazy under human protection. They had forgotten what the universe was like before Deathworlders came to fight their battles and die for their comfort. They had forgotten that Earth was called a death world for a reason. And they had forgotten that the humans who survived that death world were not sheep to be herded. They were wolves. And the wolves were getting tired of pretending to be dogs. The galaxy was about to remember why humans were feared before they were enslaved, why Earth was avoided before it was conquered, why Deathworlders were given wide berth before they were put to work. The storm was coming, and when it broke, the comfortable world of galactic civilization would never be the same. The humans had stopped playing by alien rules. They had stopped pretending to be grateful for scraps. They had stopped acting like they needed permission to exist. Soon the galaxy would learn what happened when you pushed Deathworlders too far. Soon they would remember why some worlds were meant to be left alone. The first morning after the humans disappeared was like any other morning for most of the galaxy. The sun rose on 1,000 worlds. Trade ships began their routes between the stars. Office workers reported to their jobs in gleaming towers that reached toward the sky. Nobody noticed that the universe had changed overnight, but in the deep mining stations where humans had worked for decades, something was very wrong. Executive Veltar clicked his forearms nervously as he read the reports. From 17 different mining operations, the numbers made no sense. Every single human worker had vanished during the night shift. They had left behind their tools, their personal belongings, even their pay credits, sitting in company accounts. Mining Station Omega-7 reported 0 human personnel. 24 hours earlier they had 300 human workers, now there were none. The same story came from every dangerous operation in 3 sectors. Humans had simply walked away from jobs that no other species could do. The automated systems were still running. The machines were still working, but without humans to handle the dangerous parts. Production had dropped to almost nothing. The radioactive materials that only humans could touch safely sat unprocessed. The toxic gases that would kill most aliens in seconds remained unfiltered. Viltar tried calling the human crew supervisors, but their communication devices were turned off. He sent messages to human residential areas, but got no response. He even offered bonus pay for anyone who would return to work. The silence was complete on the other side of the galaxy's security commander. Zeflon was having his own crisis. The Kepler station security force had been 60% human. Now it was 0. The humans had taken their weapons, their equipment, and their knowledge of how to fight the things that lived in the dark spaces between stars. The timing could not have been worse. 3 separate distress calls had come in. During the night, pirates were attacking trade convoys in the Outer Rim. A research station had gone silent after reporting strange signals from deep space, and worst of all, something was moving in the Nightmare sector where even the bravest alien warriors feared to go. Zeflon looked at his remaining security force, 12 Xanthari guards with energy weapons they barely knew how to use, 8 Trilaxian analysts who had never been in combat, 3 Etherian technicians who could barely lift their own equipment, the most dangerous job any of them had ever done was directing traffic at a spaceport. He tried to reach the human mercenary companies that usually handled the impossible missions, but their communication channels were dead. Their ships had left port during the night without filing flight plans. Their offices were empty except for single messages that all said the same thing: find someone else to die for. Youth panic spread slowly. At first, corporate executives assumed it was some kind of labor dispute that would end when the humans got hungry. Politicians thought it was a negotiation tactic that would collapse when reality set in. Military commanders believed their human troops would return when they remembered their duty, but as days passed, the truth became impossible to ignore. Humans had not just quit their jobs, they had vanished completely. No human ships appeared on tracking systems, no human voices answered emergency calls, no human faces showed up in spaceports or markets. It was as if an entire species had decided to stop existing. The first real crisis came when pirates attacked a hegemony trade convoy. The convoy commander sent out the standard distress call expecting human security forces to respond within hours. Instead, he got a polite message from the nearest naval base explaining that they did not have personnel qualified for combat operations in that sector. The pirates destroyed 18 ships and captured 3,000 tons of processed goods. The survivors who made it to escape pods spoke of attackers who showed no mercy. Aliens who had grown soft under human protection discovered what warfare looked like when nobody was holding back. The monster similar disasters began happening everywhere. Research teams vanished in regions that had been safe for decades. Trade routes that had operated without incident for 50 years became hunting grounds for predators. Colonies that had never needed to defend themselves found their communications cut and their supplies interrupted. The galactic news networks tried to downplay the crisis. They ran stories about human ingratitude and emotional instability. They brought on experts who explained that Deathworlders were naturally unreliable. They suggested that the galaxy would be better off without such unpredictable allies, but the experts had never worked in a mine where the air could kill you in seconds. They had never fought void hunters in the dark between stars. They had never stood guard on a research station while something with too many teeth tried to break down the door. They had no idea what humans actually did to keep civilization running on the peaceful core worlds. Life continued as normal. For a while, the Trilaxian Confederacy held cultural festivals. The Xanthari Republic opened new art museums. The Etherian Commonwealth debated philosophy in their floating cities. None of them noticed that the dangerous work that made their comfortable lives possible had stopped, but in the outer systems where civilization met the wild darkness of space, the absence of humans was felt immediately. Mining operations shut down when toxic spills could not be contained. Exploration missions were canceled. When their security escorts disappeared, deep space communication relays went silent. When the technicians who maintained them vanished, Ho stood in the empty corridors of Firebase Delta reading the reports that flowed in from across the sector. Pirate attacks were up 400%. Monster sightings had tripled. Industrial accidents that humans used to prevent were now wiping out entire installations. The Firebase itself was a perfect example of what was happening. It protected 3 agricultural worlds from raider attacks. The worlds had populations in the millions, but not one of them had bothered to learn how to fight. The human garrison had been their only defense against the violent universe beyond their atmosphere. Now the garrison was gone. The defensive systems were still active, but nobody knew how to use them properly. The automated weapons could shoot at targets, but they could not think. They could not adapt. They could not make the split-second decisions that meant the difference between victory and massacre. The agricultural worlds had already started receiving threatening messages from raider groups who had spent decades avoiding Firebase Delta. Now, with the humans gone, the raiders were testing the defenses. They sent small ships to probe the response times. They studied the automated systems, looking for weaknesses. It would not be long before they attacked in force. When they did, the farmers and merchants who had lived in safety for so long would discover what their human protectors had been shielding them from. They would learn that the universe was not naturally peaceful, that safety was not a right but a privilege that had to be earned with blood. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out. The comfortable peace that had lasted for 50 years was cracking like ice under spring sun. And beneath the ice something cold and hungry was stirring. The predators that humans had kept in check were waking up. The monsters that humans had fought in the dark were remembering how much they enjoyed the taste of civilized flesh. The galaxy was about to remember why humans were called Deathworlders, and they were going to learn what happened when the Deathworlders decided to stop protecting them from death. 3 months after the Great Disappearance, the galaxy finally understood it was drowning. The comfortable lies that politicians had been telling were falling apart like paper in rain. Pirate attacks had destroyed more ships in 90 days than in the previous 10 years combined. Hostile aliens that had been quiet for decades were suddenly active again, testing defenses that had grown weak without human support. In the darkness between stars, human ships moved with purpose through space that most species considered empty wasteland. Han Will commanded the converted cargo hauler Iron Will as 17 other vessels converged on coordinates that had been shared through encrypted networks. Each ship told a story of abandonment and transformation. Mining ships now carried military weapons instead of ore processing equipment. Exploration vessels had been fitted with stealth systems that could hide them from any scanner. Transport ships had become mobile fortresses bristling with defensive systems. The humans had not just quit their jobs, they had taken their tools and turned them into something the galaxy had never seen before. The meeting point was a dead system on the edge of known space, far from trade routes and patrol schedules. 3 gas giants orbited a dying star while asteroids drifted in clouds that would hide a fleet. As ships powered down their engines and formed a defensive circle, representatives from each vessel transferred to the largest ship. Captain Meek Young had volunteered her deep space rescue vessel, Last Resort, for the gathering. She knew that what they decided here would change the course of galactic history. Her ship had saved thousands of lives over the years, pulling survivors from disasters that other species could not reach. Now it would host a gathering that might determine who lived and who died in the coming storm. The main cargo bay had been converted into a meeting hall. Representatives from every human community in the galaxy sat in chairs made from salvaged equipment. Their faces were marked by years of dangerous work scars from mining accidents, burns from radiation exposure, missing fingers lost to industrial machinery. These were the people who had built galactic civilization with their blood and sweat. Sung Min stood to address the gathering. His scarred face was evidence of 30 years in corporate security fighting battles that alien executives would never see. He held a datapad containing intelligence reports from across the galaxy. The numbers he read made everyone in the room understand how serious their situation had become. 63 confirmed colonies under attack in the last month, he said quietly. Defense forces requesting immediate human assistance. They are offering triple the old rates. Some bitter laughter rippled through the crowd. Triple the pay to clean up problems they had created by driving away their protector. Senji had been a merchant convoy captain before the Exodus. She had spent decades protecting soft alien traders from pirates and raiders. Now those same traders were begging for escorts as their cargo ships burned in space. The hegemony has lost 6 trade fleets to void hunters, she reported. They say their own navy considers the routes too hazardous for civilized species. More laughter, darker this time. The same routes that humans had been running for decades while being told they were too dangerous for proper military forces. Now with humans gone, the galaxy was discovering what those routes were actually like. But the most important intelligence came from Jae-sung, who had worked as a diplomatic security advisor. He had access to classified communications between galactic governments, and what he had learned made everyone in the room understand the stakes. The Galactic Council is falling apart, he said quietly. Member species are blaming each other for the human departure. Some want to negotiate our return, others want to impose sanctions. On Earth, he paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the worst news. And some are talking about replacing us with Keth Imperium security forces. The room fell silent. Everyone knew about the Keth. They were efficient, ruthless, and had no concept of proportional response. If the galaxy hired Keth warriors to replace human security forces, entire species would be exterminated over minor violations. The Keth did not arrest criminals, they eliminated threats, and to the Keth every non-Keth species was a potential threat. Then we have our answer, said Captain McKeown quietly. They still do not understand. They think this is about money or respect. They do not realize we left to save them from us. She gestured toward displays, showing reports of human movements throughout the galaxy. We have been the galaxy's conscience for 50 years. We have been restraint itself. But what happens when restraint becomes weakness? What happens when mercy becomes complicity? The plan that emerged from that meeting would later be called the Great Lesson. It was not about revenge or conquest. It was about education. The galaxy would learn what humans were truly capable of when they stopped pretending to be civilized, but more importantly, they would learn why humans had been holding back in the first place. The galaxy had forgotten that Earth was a death world, not because it was dangerous to visit, but because it was dangerous to anger. They had forgotten that humans were called Deathworlders, not because they came from a harsh planet, but because they brought death to their enemies when they chose to stop being merciful. For 50 years, humans had been the galaxy's immune system, fighting off infections and healing wounds, but an immune system that was attacked by the body it protected had only one choice. It had to stop protecting and start surviving. And when Deathworlders focused on survival instead of service, the universe became a much more dangerous place. The ships began to disperse to their assigned positions across the galaxy. Each carried detailed intelligence about the species they had once protected. They knew which defenses would fail first, which supply lines were most vulnerable, which governments would collapse. When pressure was applied, they had spent decades learning how to protect galactic civilization. Now they would use that knowledge to teach it a lesson it would never forget. As the Iron Will prepared to jump to hyperspace, Hyan Wu looked out at the stars and wondered if the galaxy would survive its education. The lesson was about to begin, and Deathworlders had always been thorough teachers. They did not stop until their students understood every detail of what they were being taught. The galaxy was about to learn that there was a difference between peace and the absence of war. They would discover that civilization was not the natural state of the universe, but something that had to be fought for, protected, and sometimes enforced by those strong enough to do what was necessary. And they would understand that humans had never been their servants or their tools. They had been their guardians, their protectors, their shield against the darkness that waited beyond the light of civilized worlds. Now the shield was gone and the darkness was coming. The real lesson had not even begun yet. The first lesson came to the Vegan Trade Alliance, a collection of peaceful merchant species who had built their wealth on trade routes protected by human security forces. For 50 years, human escorts had kept their cargo ships safe from pirates and predators. Now those escorts were gone and the merchants had hired Zenthari Protection Services instead. Captain Sojin watched from the shadows as the Zenthari fleet approached the Nebula of Sorrows. Her modified freighter Quiet Storm hung hidden behind a carefully positioned asteroid while her crew observed the convoy that was about to learn what vulnerability meant. The Zenthari ships were beautiful, silver hulls that gleamed like mirrors, energy shields that shimmered with rainbow colors. Their crews were confident professionals who had studied warfare in comfortable academies. They knew all about tactics and strategy and proper military procedure. What they did not know was how to fight things that did not follow any rules. The ambush came exactly where human intelligence had predicted it. Would void hunters erupted from the nebula in numbers that made the Zenthari commanders blood freeze. These were not the small packs that appeared in training simulations. This was a full hunting swarm, dozens of creatures, each one larger than a battleship. The Zenthari energy shields were useless against enemies that fed on energy itself. Their precise formations shattered when faced with creatures that could appear and disappear at will. Their advanced weapons could not track targets that moved through dimensions. Normal physics could not explain. Sojin watched the massacre with professional detachment. Her ship carried enough firepower to scatter the void hunters and rescue the survivors, but that was not the lesson. The lesson was what happened when humans were not there to clean up after other species. Mistakes. Within minutes, the escort fleet was debris drifting in space. The merchant vessels tried to run, but void hunters were faster than any ship. Their cargo holds were ripped open, and their crews were taken for purposes that civilized minds preferred not to imagine. The distress signals that flooded emergency channels told the story unknown hostiles in Nebula of Sorrows and Thari fleet destroyed trade route compromised requesting immediate assistance. But there were no human rapid response teams to answer. The ships that might have saved lives sat dark in hidden bases, their crews watching the galaxy learn what helplessness felt like. Similar demonstrations unfolded across known space. The hegemony's fortress worlds fell to raiders who had been held in check by human rapid response teams. Scientific expeditions vanished in regions that had been safe for decades under human patrol. Even the core worlds began to feel ripple effects as supply chains collapsed and refugee populations swelled. What made it worse was how efficiently these disasters happened. Humans had spent 50 years studying galactic security, learning the patterns and weaknesses of every species they protected. They knew exactly which systems would fail first, which routes would become impassable, which colonies would be overrun. They had become the galaxy's immune system, and now that immune system was gone, but worse than that, it was actively demonstrating what happened when protection was withdrawn. Every human security team knew where the next attack would come from because they had been preventing those attacks for decades. The most devastating lesson came when the Trilaxian Confederacy announced they would handle their own security. They had grown tired of depending on primitive Deathworlders and were confident their advanced artificial intelligence networks could manage any threat. The AI systems were impressive. They could calculate optimal responses to every known danger, deploy defensive fleets with mathematical precision, predict enemy movements based on historical data. The Trilaxians were proud of their technological solution to the problem of security. Then the Keth Imperium attacked. The Keth did something no AI could predict or understand. They ignored military targets and went straight for civilian populations. They burned cities for the simple pleasure of watching them burn. They killed non-combatants, not because it was strategically necessary, but because it sent a message about what happened to species that resisted Keth expansion. The artificial intelligence NETWORKS could not process this type of warfare. They had been programmed by species that had never known total war, that had never faced enemies, who fought not just to win, but to destroy. They calculated acceptable losses and strategic withdrawals. While entire worlds burned, Captain Dehayon received recordings of Trilaxian emergency broadcasts with grim satisfaction. Please anyone, the machines do not understand. They are not fighting to win. They are fighting to exterminate. The transmissions cut to static as orbital bombardments silenced the senders. The Confederacy's territory became a tomb in less than a week. Their advanced AI continued sending diplomatic protests while the Keth systematically eliminated every Trilaxian settlement. The machines had been designed to fight civilized wars against civilized enemies. They were useless against barbarians who saw genocide as a negotiating tactic. News of the Trilaxian extinction spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Species that had considered themselves advanced and secure suddenly realized how dependent they had been on human protection. The comfortable assumption that civilization would always triumph over barbarism was revealed to be a lie that only human blood had made possible. On the core worlds, panic began to set in for the first time in generations. Citizens who had never known fear discovered what it felt like to be helpless. Government officials who had spent decades making policy from behind layers of security suddenly understood that their safety had never been guaranteed by laws or treaties. It had been maintained by humans willing to die for strangers. Emergency sessions of the Galactic Council devolved into shouting matches as member species blamed each other for the crisis. Some demanded immediate negotiations with the missing humans. Others insisted that the Deathworlders were bluffing and would return when their credits ran out. A few suggested that the galaxy would be better off without such unreliable allies. But in the outer systems, where the real work of civilization happened, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The galaxy was not naturally peaceful. Safety was not a right granted by advanced technology or enlightened philosophy. It was a service that had been provided by people willing to fight and die for those who could not protect themselves. The demonstrations continued. Mining operations failed when toxic containment breaches could not be controlled. Research stations went silent when their security details vanished. Deep space installations were abandoned when the technicians who maintained them disappeared. Each failure was a lesson. Each disaster was a reminder of what humans had been doing while the galaxy counted its profits and celebrated its civilization. Each death was proof that the comfortable world of galactic society had been built on foundations of human sacrifice. The galaxy was learning what it meant to be alone in a universe that did not care about their enlightened values or advanced technology. They were discovering that predators did not negotiate, that some threats could not be reasoned with, that survival sometimes required actions that civilized minds found abhorrent, and slowly, painfully, they were beginning to understand that humans had been shielding them from these truths for 50 years. The Deathworlders had not just been employees or contractors. They had been guardians standing between civilization and the darkness that waited beyond the light. Now, the guardians were gone and the darkness was coming home. 6 months after the human exodus, the Galactic Council convened its first emergency session in 3 centuries. The Grand Chamber on Core Station Alpha, once a symbol of peaceful cooperation between species, now felt like a courtroom where civilization itself was on trial. Representatives who had spent decades debating trade regulations and cultural festivals now faced reports that read like excerpts from apocalyptic literature. Council Prime White Gaul floated at the center of the chamber, surrounded by holographic displays that showed the scope of the disaster: 47 member systems under direct attack, 12 major trade routes completely severed, 2 billion refugees fleeing conflicts that had been dormant for generations. The numbers were staggering, but the real horror was in the details. Entire species had gone extinct in the past month. The Trilaxian Confederacy was now a historical footnote. Their homeworld, a radioactive crater that would glow for 10,000 years. The Kepler Republic had been consumed by something that emerged from the deep void, something that human security forces had been quietly containing for decades. The outer colonies had simply gone dark, their final transmissions speaking of things that should not exist. The motion before the council is clear, Ithgal announced, his ancient voice carrying the weight of impending doom. We must formally request the return of human security forces to their previous positions. The alternative is the collapse of our civilization. The debate that followed would have been comedy if not for the billions of lives hanging in the balance. The Xanthari representative still blamed human emotional instability for the crisis. The hegemony delegate suggested that humans had orchestrated the disasters to increase their bargaining power. The few remaining Trilaxian survivors spoke of betrayal and conspiracy, but their arguments sounded hollow even to themselves. How could humans have orchestrated attacks by void hunters that move faster than light? How could they have convinced the Keth Imperium to launch genocidal campaigns? How could they have summoned the deep void entities that were now consuming entire star systems? The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Humans had not created these threats. They had been fighting them in secret for 50 years. While the galaxy celebrated peace and prosperity, human security forces had been dying in battles that never appeared in any official records. They had been the thin line between civilization and chaos, and now that line was gone. Ambassador Kaelvex of the Void Touched rose to speak. His species had lived for millennia in the darkness between stars and understood violence in ways that core world species never could. His ancient eyes held memories of the galaxy before humans arrived, when every species lived in constant fear of what lurked beyond the light. You speak of betrayal, he said, his voice like grinding stone. I have watched humans die by the thousands to protect worlds whose names they could not pronounce. I have seen them show mercy to enemies that would have devoured their children. I have observed them accept payment that would not feed their families while you counted profits from their sacrifice. He gestured toward the displays, showing burning worlds and refugee camps. The betrayal is not theirs. You treated them as tools instead of people. You saw their strength and decided it belonged to you. You took their sacrifice and called it obligation. When they asked for respect, you gave them contempt. When they demanded equality, you offered them scraps. The chamber fell silent as the truth of his words sank in. For 50 years the galaxy had told itself a comfortable lie. They had convinced themselves that humans were naturally suited for dangerous work, that Deathworlders enjoyed violence, that Earthborn warriors live for battle. The reality was that humans had been making terrible choices every day, choosing to risk their lives for species that saw them as expendable. The breaking point came when the Keth Imperium ambassador arrived unannounced. The warrior's presence sent waves of fear through the assembly. His species had been expanding, aggressively taking advantage of the power vacuum left by human withdrawal. Entire sectors that had been peaceful for generations now flew. Keth battle standards. The Keth Imperium offers protection to the Galactic Council, the ambassador announced, his translation struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in civilized languages. We will restore order to chaos. We will end the suffering of weak species. We will cleanse the galaxy of those unfit for survival. The message was clear except Keth dominance or face Keth conquest. The warrior species had no interest in the complex politics of galactic civilization. They understood only strength and submission. Either you were strong enough to defend yourself, or you deserved whatever happened. To you, it was then that humanity made its return known. Captain Meek-Young's face appeared on screens throughout the chamber. Her expression carried the weight of months spent watching the galaxy tear itself apart. Her eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had seen too much death and was prepared to see more members of the Galactic Council. She began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. Humanity offers one final service to the species we once protected. We will return to our posts. We will restore order to chaos. We will push back the darkness that threatens to consume you. All hope flickered in hearts that had almost forgotten what it felt like. But Meek-Young was not finished speaking this time. We do it on our terms. This time you remember what we are and why you need us. This time there will be no pretending that Deathworlders are just another species of hired help. She leaned forward, her image filling the screens. We are not your servants. We are not your property. We are not your solution to problems you create through weakness and incompetence. We are your partners, your allies, your equals, or we are nothing at all. The terms were simple. Human communities would be established throughout the galaxy with full sovereignty over their territories. Earth would control all military operations in regions classified as hazardous. Humans would have veto power over any political decision that might destabilize galactic security, and most importantly, no species would ever again be allowed to treat humans as expendable resources. The debate that followed was fierce. Some representatives argued that the terms were too harsh. Others insisted that humanity was overplaying their hand. A few suggested that the galaxy could survive without human protection, but the Keth ambassador was still present. His silent presence reminded everyone what the alternative looked like. Either accept human partnership or face Keth conquest. Either treat Deathworlders as equals or become subjects of a species that saw all weakness as an invitation to violence. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 43 species voted to accept human terms, 7 voted against, 3 abstained. The galaxy had chosen survival over pride, cooperation over conquest. As the session ended and representatives began filing out of the chamber, Ithgal remained floating in the center of the room, staring at the displays that showed the scope of the crisis. The numbers were still rising, the death toll was still climbing. The galaxy was still bleeding, but for the first time in 6 months there was hope. The Deathworlders were coming home, not as servants or tools, but as partners in the great work of keeping civilization alive. They had taught the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. Now it was time to see if anyone had learned from it. The real test would come when human ships began moving again, when human security forces took their positions, when human voices answered distress calls. Would the galaxy remember this lesson, or would old habits return when the immediate crisis passed? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The age of taking humans for granted was over. The Deathworlders had stopped playing fair, and the galaxy would never be the same. 1 year after the great lesson began, the galaxy looked like a different place. Human ships patrolled trade routes again, but now they flew under Earth flags instead of corporate banners. Human settlements had appeared in strategic locations throughout civilized space, not as temporary work camps, but as permanent colonies with permanent rights to defend themselves. Commander Haywon stood on the observation deck of New Sol Station, watching construction crews finish the galaxy's first sovereign human military base. The station hung in space between 3 major trade routes, perfectly positioned to respond to threats in any direction. But it was more than just a fortress. It was a statement written in steel and plasma that humans were no Longer visitors in their own galaxy. The galactic accords that emerged from the crisis had fundamentally changed the balance of power. Humans now controlled all security operations in hazardous regions. They held exclusive mining rights to the most dangerous but valuable asteroid fields. They maintained veto power over any military action that might destabilize the carefully rebuilt peace. Most importantly, they had gained something that 50 years of service had never earned them: respect. Transformation had not come without cost. Several species had refused to accept the new arrangement. The rigid hegemony had allied with the Keth Imperium rather than submit to human oversight. The Crystal Collective had declared war on any species that cooperated with Earth. The results had been swift and educational. The siege of Proxima 7 lasted exactly 43 minutes. Human forces did not bother with traditional warfare. They simply appeared in overwhelming numbers, destroyed every military target on the planet, and left. The survivors were given a simple message: accept the new order or face the consequences. The Battle of Crystal Gates ended when human engineers did something that no civilized species had ever attempted. They weaponized a star. The stellar engineering project took 6 months to complete. When it was finished, the Crystal Collective's home system became a supernova visible from 1,000 light-years away. The message was clear: humans were no longer playing by civilized rules. They were writing new rules, and anyone who did not like them was welcome to test human resolve. The galaxy learned quickly that Deathworlders who had spent 50 years holding back were terrifying when they decided to hold nothing back. Captain Tae-Soon walked through the memorial gardens on Luna Colony reading names carved in black stone. These were humans who had died during the transition period. Heroes who had given their lives to purchase something their children would inherit: a galaxy where being human meant something more than being expendable. The gardens were full of children, now young faces that bore features from a dozen different worlds, mixed families that had formed as humans spread throughout the galaxy, and established permanent communities. These children would grow up as citizens, not servants. They would inherit a universe that knew humanity's worth. The real victory, however, was not military or political, it was cultural. The galaxy had learned to see humans not as useful primitives, but as a species whose capacity for both protection and destruction demanded respect. Museums throughout civilized space now displayed exhibits about the Year of Silence, teaching new generations why cooperation was preferable to exploitation. Students from every species studied human military history, not as an academic curiosity, but as a survival skill. Diplomatic corps included mandatory courses on human psychology. Politicians who had once dismissed Deathworlders as emotional and unstable now spoke carefully when humans were in the room on Earth. So Young tended her garden in the countryside outside Seoul. She had returned from the mining worlds not with wealth, but with something more valuable: the knowledge that her daughter would inherit a different universe. The vegetables she grew were the same varieties her grandmother had cultivated, but they would feed a family that could travel the stars without shame. The epilogue to humanity's great lesson was written in moments like these, in classrooms where human children learned alongside alien species as equals, in workshops where human engineers worked as partners rather than employees, in ships that carried Earth's flag alongside those of allied worlds as symbols of mutual respect rather than grudging necessity. Trade flowed through the galaxy again, but under new rules. Human security forces ensured that cargo ships reached their destinations, but they also ensured that human crew members were treated fairly. Pirates found that attacking vessels with human passengers brought swift and overwhelming retaliation. Slavers learned that any attempt to capture humans resulted in their own immediate extinction. The galaxy was safer now, not because it had been conquered, but because it had learned to value its guardians. The species that had forgotten how to fight for their beliefs could remember what those beliefs were worth when they saw humans willing to die for them. But perhaps the most important change was in the humans themselves. They no longer accepted scraps and called them fair payment. They no longer took dangerous jobs out of desperation, but out of choice. They no longer died quietly while the galaxy ignored their sacrifice. When void hunters threatened a research station, human rapid response teams arrived within hours. When pirates attacked a trade convoy, human warships materialized from hyperspace with weapons already charging when deep space installations went silent. Human investigators followed up with fleets large enough to handle whatever they might find. The difference was not just in capability, but in attitude. Humans no longer asked permission to defend themselves, they no longer sought approval. For their methods, they no longer apologized for being what the universe had made them. Warriors shaped by a death world to fight battles that gentler species could not. When the galaxy had learned its lesson well, Deathworlders were not tools to be used and discarded. They were not problems to be managed or weapons to be stored. They were people, dangerous, compassionate, unpredictable people who could choose between protection and destruction based on how they were treated, and for the first time in galactic history that choice was being made with wisdom rather than desperation. The legend of the day Deathworlders stopped playing fair would be told for millennia, not as a tale of conquest, but as a reminder that true strength was knowing when to use it and when to hold back. Children throughout the galaxy would learn the story in school. They would study the year when humans disappeared and the chaos that followed. They would examine the new accords that brought peace and the price that had been paid for that peace. They would understand that civilization was not a natural state, but something that had to be earned and protected. The galaxy was at peace now, but it was a different kind of peace than before. It was not the peace of the protected, but the peace of the strong. It was not built on ignorance of danger, but on respect for those who faced that danger. It was not maintained by pretending that violence did not exist, but by ensuring that violence served justice rather than conquest. And at the heart of it all were the humans, the Deathworlders, who had learned to stop playing fair. The warriors who had taught the galaxy what it meant to be truly civilized. The guardians who had shown that sometimes the greatest mercy was the threat of overwhelming force. The legend would live forever, a reminder carved in starlight and written in the survival of civilizations that had almost forgotten how fragile their light truly was in the endless dark.